So I'm delighted to welcome Dave Hill, who's going to talk about how Lower Clapton grew up, a story told by its homes. So thank you very much, Dave.
Okay. Okay, so welcome to the low-tech part of the proceedings. I stand before you as a man with no slides. Believe me, I've worked very, very hard on writing my talk, but slides, I just don't know how to do them. So I do have some props, and I have a very nice jumper on at Paul Smith's, so you'll have to feast your eyes on that instead. I will paint some pictures in words for you as best I can. So as Janet was saying, I am Dave Hill. For about 9 years, I was the London commentator of The Guardian, a job I did on a freelance basis from my home, of which more to come. And for the last 9 years, I have published and edited my own multi-contributor website called On London. I also stand before you not pretending to be a historian. Certainly not a historian of architecture or anything like that. I am simply a journalist with some experience of putting together stories from available evidence and a certain amount of personal experience. And that is the sort of story that you're going to hear. But I hope it's a story that is faithful to facts as far as some of them can be established. And just as importantly, faithful to the spirit that I think characterizes Lower Clapton, which is the neighbourhood that I've lived in for the past 34 years. So it is, as advertised, a story of Lower Clapton through its housing and, of course, the people who live in it. The context for it, though, is not really historical. It is actually pretty contemporary. And its wider canvas is not just the whole of Hackney, but the whole of London. Because for many years now, people, including me, have been talking, writing, and often arguing about what we have called London's housing crisis and how to solve it. And I've used the past tense there because quite recently my friends at London Councils, which is the organisation that represents all of the capital's 33 local authorities, began calling it not just a crisis, but an emergency. And it is an emergency of many dimensions. House prices, as you know, and private sector rents, as you know, have become insanely expensive, not just in my bit of Hackney, but all of Hackney and the whole of the city. And far beyond the reach of people, even people with quite good incomes. The supply of various kinds of homes for rent at levels below market levels has not kept up with the demand for it, and much of what there is condition. Homelessness has been rising, and councils across London have been spending huge sums of money to house homeless individuals and families in what is often unsuitable accommodation. Maybe we can learn some lessons from the past about what to do next. The housing emergency in all its forms threatens the future of the UK capital, both as an urban society that has much to recommend it and as an economic engine on which, whether people elsewhere like it or not, the entire UK depends. I'm going to remind Andy Burnham of that next time I see him. Hackney is very much affected by that emergency, and part of this talk will examine how it manifests itself and has done in the part of Hackney where I live. But first of all, let me invite you into my home, at least in your imaginations. So I've lived in Lower Clapton since 1992 in a house on Thistlethwaite Road. That's a turning, some of you will know this, I think, off Lower Clapton Road, where this building is also located, but at the other end of it, just past Clapton Pond and just before you get to the Lea Bridge roundabout. Step inside in your imaginations and let me show you the place on the wall in the hall where beneath the wallpaper some numbers have been written in pencil. I wish I could remember exactly what the numbers are. It's a long time since I put up any new wallpaper. But I'm pretty sure that the first two are a 1 and an 8, and I'm pretty sure that there are 4 numbers altogether. And I was pretty sure at the time I found them, when stripping old wallpaper away that they signified a year 18 something something. And that would make sense because the 19th century late on was when Thistlethwaite Road was created. Before I say more about that, let's get a sense of just how dramatic the building up of Lower Clapton and its adjoining areas had already been before the street I live on was built. Back in the late 15th century, a baronial mansion was built on the site, now occupied by the educational institution until recently called B6, and now renamed New City College, following a merger. In the 16th century, Henry VIII used to hang out there when it was known as Brooke House. In the 17th century, the famous diarist Samuel Pepys paid a visit to Brooke House during a day trip to Hackney. He waxed lyrical about the extensive gardens where oranges and other exotic plants grew. Pepys quite often came to Hackney to take the air. After all, it was far from the city with its rats and disease, and soon to come, its ruinous Great Fire. Hackney was the countryside. In the 18th century, another noted writer, Daniel Defoe, could still remark on Hackney's popularity as a retreat for the wealthy. He wasn't far wrong. For example, close to Brooke House stood an old manorial dwelling where a Bishop Wood of Lichfield and Coventry had lived. He had also had some almshouses built for the poor, and we'll come back to those later. In 1749, the manor house was sold to a gem merchant. Lower Clapton was still a retreat for the wealthy even then. But from around that time, middle of the 18th century, it seems that Lower Clapton's built environment was beginning to change. And why wouldn't it have done that? Because after all, the Industrial Revolution was just getting underway. My sense from the historical accounts I've consulted on putting this talk together is that Clapton maybe started to become a place rather than just somewhere you pass through on the way to somewhere else. More buildings began to appear along what was then called Hackney Lane and came to be known as Upper Clapton Road and Lower Clapton Road. And as we get into the 19th century, excuse me, licks finger, turns page, Clapton as a whole could, it seems, no longer really be described as only sparsely inhabited and properties there owned only by people of substantial financial means. Tradesmen and labourers, not many, just 20 or so, are recorded as having lived on Lea Bridge Road. And it's worth perhaps remembering, it came to mind anyway, that the nearby Lower Lea Valley was a corridor of industry at that time. By 1831, according to A History of the County of Middlesex, Volume 10, Hackney, big book, Upper Clapton was a genteel area with many detached houses. Development more generally was creeping up from Homerton, from the south. In 1842, Laura Place had been built just to the north of the local orphanage, which is where the Lower Clapton Health Centre now is, on Linscott Road at the end of it there, and was described as a respectable row. A map made in the first half of the 19th century, which I discovered last night, in fact it's an early Ordnance Survey map, still shows Clapton and Homerton and Shacklewell and Dalston to have not very many buildings. But within a couple of decades, new housing in particular was coming out of the ground at quite a pace. Between 1867 and 1870, a building firm called the London and Suburban Land Company laid out Chatsworth Road, which we all know and love, of course, along what is described as having at that time been a field path. And the company also filled some of the space between Chatsworth Road and Lower Clapton Road with Clifton Road and Glenarm Road and others. Now, I was curious about the London Suburban Land Company. Note that word suburban. These days, I don't think we people who live around this way think of ourselves as being suburban at all. Terribly uncool. I searched for the name at Company's House, and there I found the London and Suburban Land and Building Company. Could it be the same one? Well, it is listed as having been incorporated in 1863, so maybe. Its current registered office is in Jermyn Street, Piccadilly. In 1869, a place called the Round Chapel was built in response to what was described in the Hackney and Kingsland Gazette as, quote, enormous migration. Be afraid, be afraid. Further north, Hackney Downs, previously amid fields, became edged by Downs Road and Downs Park Road, where a famous school for boys was established in 1876. As with impressive round chapels, you don't build new schools unless there is local demand for them in the form of local people living in local houses. Much of the stimulus for housing development in Clapton, Upper and Lower, came from the arrival of Clapton Station, opened in 1872 by the Great Eastern Railway Company, and also a tramway. Transport links attract housing development. That's one thing that never changes. And by the way, if you, like me, use Clapton Station a lot, you will know that the original waiting room there has recently been beautifully restored to its original form. Anybody seen it? Really very nice indeed. Soon and inevitably, the wave of urban transformation swept more of the old Lower Clapton away. According to A History of the County of Middlesex, Volume 10, Hackney, it records that the demolition of Clapton House, and that was by then the name of a grand retreat where the bishop and the gem merchant had lived, was knocked down, and its sweeping away literally prepared the ground for the arrival of Thistlethwaite Road. What was it like in the avenue of terraced houses that replaced Clapton House in the 1880s? There are some clues, and here is my first prop, which you can't see properly because you're too far away. But if you want to have a look at it afterwards, you're very welcome to do that. It found its way into my house. I've no idea. You know, things turn up. People find them and suddenly they're there. But as you will see when you have a look later on, there are absolutely no cars parked along it, as you would expect. There are one or two open carriages, the sort of thing that you would attach a horse to, maybe. And only one person appears in the photograph, a woman in what I think of as classic female Victorian attire. The street is tree-lined, as now, but the trees are short and scrawny. They look newly planted. And then there is what Charles Booth made of the area at that time, Prop 2. Charles Booth, as you know, was a great Victorian social reformer and a Liverpudlian, by the way, which I've only just discovered. He was famous for his colour-coded maps. They were called the Maps Descriptive of London Poverty, but more usually known simply as Booth's Poverty Maps. And there's a lovely volume of them here. These were compiled between 1886 and 1903, so nice timing for Thistlethwaite Road. In this large and heavy book, Lower Clapton appears in a section called the North Eastern District. And that covers Homerton, Hackney Downs, Hackney Marsh, and both Upper and Lower Clapton. It shows that by the end of the 19th century, unlike the early part, this bit of northeast London was absolutely full of residential streets, development at an astonishing scale. I can't tell you exactly when the streets closest to mine, Newick Road, Mildenhall Road, and so on, were built, but I can tell you that some of the others were not constructed until after Charles Booth made his map. That's because they're not on his map. Everything on the other side of Cornthwaite Road, that is the Millfields Park side, heading down towards the Lea Valley, they came later, so there was still demand. And they're in a different style too. Thornby Road, Fletching Road, Coatsback Road. They're in a different style, smaller, a bit cosier. No basements, I don't think, no steps up to the door. Booth tells us quite a lot about the inhabitants of the new streets that had been formed in the previous 50 or so years. His commentary is, I think, about the North East District as a whole, but I don't think it excludes Lower Clapton. The whole of this district is well-to-do, he wrote. Yes, there were a few exceptions, but according to Booth, there really are no poor. He added, there is much open space that is public, such as Hackney Downs and Millfields, and much that is private in the gardens attached to almost every lane. Very struck by that use of the word lane. Does it tell us that Booth and everyone else at the time still thought of that part of Hackney as being essentially rural? Booth, in his studies of London, also drew on census data to define more than 75% of the area's residents as, quote, living in comfort, and 80% living in homes that were not crowded. Another interesting statistic says that 41% of the heads of families were born outside of London, which surprised me, but it seems to suggest that the capital then, as now, was a magnet for people originally from elsewhere. Certainly what we might call the Greater London at that time uh, experienced enormous population growth in the second half of the 19th century, in particular, the second half in particular, as London boomed. At its beginning, this theoretical Greater London contained about 1 million people. By the end, it contained well over 6 million. Much of that growth caused by inward migration. That is an extraordinary change. The Industrial Revolution had happened. Cities had become the nation's centres of economic activity, of productivity, of growth, of wealth. The demand for new housing was massive. Landowners and house builders supplied. In the early 1900s, the largely residential character of Lower Clapton, with its Victorian and some early Edwardian housing, was established, and it was, I suppose, a sort of new build middle-class paradise. Follow me again in your mind's eyes down to the basement of my house. There I will show you a hole in the corner of the ceiling. I've often wondered if a bell used to hang from there, attached to a string reaching up to floors above, so that those upstairs could summon those downstairs if they required, for example, a cup of imperial tea or a slice of Victoria sponge. Could it really have been that posh? Well, maybe not. By the 1930s, the story of the street and those nearby was developing strands of narrative that I, when I moved to Thistlethwaite Road half a century or so later, was almost able to touch. In 1930, at number 19 Thistlethwaite Road, the only child of Jewish parents of Eastern European descent was born. The house was later described by The Guardian's theatre critic Michael Billington as a solid red brick three-storey villa just off the noisy, bustling, traffic-ridden thoroughfare of the Lower Clapton Road. The reason for Billington's interest was that the child who was born there was Harold Pinter, one of the country's most influential modern dramatists. A plaque now marks the spot. His father was a tailor, his mother kept house. He was a child of the lower middle class. That was Lower Clapton. It was also an area where many of Pinter's fellow Jewish Londoners had long lived. A synagogue, a rather beautiful one, the Clapton Federation Synagogue, designed by Marcus Kenneth Glass, and there's one but there certainly was one in Manchester designed by the same architect, had been founded just a stone's throw away on Lea Bridge Road in 1919. Thistlethwaite Road itself has been formally acknowledged as having a Jewish inheritance. One of the inhabitants of Clapton House, the one knocked down to make way for the street, had a private synagogue built in its grounds, and this is recognised by another plaque mounted on number 25, 3 doors down from the former house of the Pinter family. And the plaque says that the synagogue was built in 1779 or 1780. Pinter would later describe Lower Clapton not as a place of, quote, respectable rows, but as a bit dilapidated and containing factories, which it did. Although apparently his house was immaculately kept. Pinter's later childhood was lived after the war. The family moved out during the Blitz, which hardly enhanced the condition of London as a whole, so perhaps that informed his childhood memories. Clapton sustained some bomb damage. Brook House was badly hit, knocked down until the 50s. If you walk along a street to the north of Lea Bridge Road, I forgot the name of it, you'll notice a sudden interruption in the style of the housing down one side. And I think that's because a bomb fell there too. Harold Pinter was also, as you will probably know, a pupil at that boys' school I mentioned earlier on Hackney Downs. He was there between 1944 and 1948, becoming one of a number of noted alumni. To get there from his home, perhaps cutting across the downs, he would have walked past or very close to a very different kind of housing from the sort he lived in, the flats of the Pembury estate built by the London County Council in the 1930s. That was the same walk that my three youngest children would take to get to the Mossbourne Academy, an entirely different school built on the same site in 2004. If we stretch a point and say that the original Pembury blocks sit at the fringe of Lower Clapton, well, some of them, as the estate stretches all the way down to the Narrowway, we can also say that the area's tenure profile began diversifying and further urbanising almost as soon as the last lanes of private housing, shown on Charles Booth's maps, were complete, and with it, its social and economic profile. Then, in the decades after the war, more new housing came to Clapton, housing built by other sorts of councils, some to the north of the roundabout, some to the south, and some right next to it. I'm thinking there of Gooch House, a 16-storey block completed by 1964, and I would deduce one of the last projects of the soon-to-be replaced metropolitan borough of Hackney. Soon after that, a little way along Kenning Hall Road, came the Greater London Council's Nightingale estate with towers of more than 20 stories. High-rise had arrived in the residential streetscape. Further south and east, tucked between Milden Hall Road, Millfields Road and Chaley Street, and not far from Millfields Parkland itself, stands the low-rise Pond Farm estate. I love that name, seemingly named in a flush of municipal bucolic reverie. The rather different spirit of post-war Labourite socialism informed the christening of the 1960s Nye Bevan estate, among others that went up. But both were badged with the idealism that infused council house building at that time, in theory, if not always in practice, as we would later see. We all know how that story started to go wrong. We've all heard it before, some of it pretty harsh and unfair, but here's one telling of it. Here comes prop 3 from Joe Thomas's 2023 novel, White Riot, which I've actually left in my bag. But anyway, I'll show it to you later. It's a brilliant book. It's a brilliant crime thriller set largely in the area. And so at one point, a policeman character approaches the Nightingale estate, and what follows are his understandings as they appear in the novel and prejudices and his prejudices, but they were not uncommon at the time, and they still aren't. 6 22-storey towers, each 65 metres high. Seaton Point, Embley Point, Farnell Point, Rachel Point, Rathbone Point, Sutherland Point, or Sutherland Point. Concrete blocks and tiny windows, boxed in like rats in a drain. A utopian solution, a community of workers, streets in the sky, communal areas dark and empty. Nothing to do but sniff glue and nick car stereos. Facilities broken, council funds never there to fix them. The bins full of rats and maggots, the street lamps smashed. Now, that may or may not have been a fair depiction of the Nightingale estate at that time, but there was a lot of it about. And so on, and so it went. That was the Hackney of the urban breakdown narrative that filled thousands of tabloid pages, a short walk, and that was just a short walk from Thistlethwaite Road, a respectable middle-class street. It was a different version, a different account of Lower Clapton and its environs, largely defined by the different sort of housing to be found there. Now, I hadn't turned up yet, but I wouldn't be long. I moved to Hackney in the early 80s, sort of by accident. I and my partner of that time needed to escape from a shared house in Islington, and the opportunity arose to move into a little terraced house not too far from Victoria Park. The property was owned by the council, but deemed unfit for council tenant habitation. It was, though, available at a very low rent for licensed squatters, which is sort of what we were. It was called short life housing. Well, and there's a reason for that anecdote, which we'll come to. My first child was born there in 1984. Also, I started to make a reasonable living as a freelance writer, and then, as if by magic, the opportunity arose to buy a house in Homerton. I've now lost my place. Can you imagine a couple in their late 20s, neither of them wealthy, neither of them able to draw on the bank of mum and dad? But we didn't need to. That's because we had Nigella Lawson's dad. Nigel Lawson, Margaret Thatcher's Chancellor, recently deceased, enacted policies that led to a house price boom and bust that left many people with mortgages owing more money than their homes were worth. But the slump in prices also gave an opportunity to people like me to get on the ladder, as they say. It also helped that Hackney had such a bad reputation at that time. It was seen as uniformly violent, dangerous and run down. And in some parts, for some people, it was. Its local authority, the London Borough of Hackney, created only 20 years earlier, which is a bit mind-blowing when you think about it, was a shambles, a disaster, a battleground, not least its housing department, by the way. House prices, surprise, surprise, tend to be a bit lower in areas like that. And Homerton at that time was widely perceived as being one of the most dangerous places on earth. Of course, it was no such thing. And it was not because I have a taste for danger that my next house move was to a turning off Lower Clapton Road, which within a few years would be given the nickname Murder Mile. It was actually because I then had 3 young children. The houses on Thistlethwaite Road had 5 bedrooms and a garden, and house prices in Hackney were still, by today's standards, astonishingly low. What became my house in Thistlethwaite Road was the first one I looked at with a view to buying back in 1992. I was instantly sold on it. Before moving to London in 1979, I had a friend who lived in one of those elegant and expensive terraces in Notting Hill, off Ladbroke Grove. I loved the steps that led up to its wide, heavy front door. I loved its short flights of stairs that went up and up and up and up. It was the classic London terrace, and it planted the seed in me that London was where I wanted to live. Okay, Thistlethwaite Road was not in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. The house I bought there was not as grand or as big, but it was the only sort of house I really wanted. And so many people feel that way, I think, about that kind of housing, that kind of architecture. It's amazing to think that when I moved in, it was already more than 100 years old. What kinds of people lived on and around Thistlethwaite Road by then? It was quite a mixture. Elderly ladies of Caribbean descent, other middle-class couples with young children like me, 1 or 2 households that would have attracted the adjective rough. A few doors down lived an elderly Jewish husband and wife who had lived there for many years. The latter remembered Harold Pinter, and that's what I meant by being within touching distance of the unfolding narrative and the period of rapid change of Lower Clapton development. That lady had letters written to her by Harold Pinter's wife, Lady Antonia Fraser. Also in the street lived pretty much every shade of left-wing person to be found on that rich and varied segment of the political spectrum. During my early years there, a luminary of Marxism Today magazine, at that point embracing what was known as Euro-communism and a New Times response to Thatcherism, lived at something like number 43. He was the foreign editor of The Guardian and went on to become editor of The Observer. Someone who I think left shortly before I arrived was a significant Labour Party person and the partner of a namesake of mine, who became Labour's communications chief. I seem to remember being told that at another address on Thistlethwaite Road lived a person described to me as a tanky. That was someone whose faith in the old Soviet Union was such that he had thought the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 hadn't been a bad idea. And I was quite literally hemmed in on both sides by members of the Socialist Workers' Party. On one side lived a veteran of that particular brand of Trotskyism, a significant figure in the counter-demonstration against a notorious National Front march in Lewisham in 1977. He had a large, unruly dog, which every so often would leap across the garden fence, defecate on my bit of grass, and then leap back again. It was as if I, a plasterer's son from a coal mining area, had been deemed the class enemy. On the other side lived a grandmother, her daughter's partner, and their son, all but the latter of the SWP cause. The grandmother played the piano rather nicely, and I would often hear it very softly through the wall of my children's bedroom as I put them to bed. By then I was writing quite often about politics and social issues, and if you were in that line of work, Lower Clapton was the best place to live. No matter what sort of anti-establishment person you wanted to speak to, a militant trade unionist, any sort of Marxist, a member of a squatting cooperative, a representative of the anarchist group Class War, whose enchanting Mugger Yuppie campaign was still alive in Hackney at that time, you would almost always discover that one lived within short walking distance. These people, of course, with their university degrees, their radical arts projects, good thing those, their green hair and their jumble sale clothing, and their vegetarianism, were the sorts of people who today rail against gentrification, despite the fact that they were the ones who started it. I was one of the people who started it too, of course, buying up and doing up my old house, having a loft conversion, having a kitchen extension, cherishing those original features that estate agents made so much of. To be fair, I did, following a period of separation, have 3 more children between 1995 and 2002 with the person to whom I am still married. And with 6 kids in the house, we really did need the extra space. And all the while, my house and the houses of everybody else in Thistlethwaite Road became more and more valuable. It was clear to me long ago that my children would struggle to buy homes near where they were born and grew up. Very common problem nowadays for lots and lots of people. They are now dispersed mostly across other cheaper parts of East London, and in most cases with some help from the bank of mum/stepmum and dad. Now, here's a story you might like, or depending on your circumstances, it might royally piss you off, but let's see. The price of that little terraced house in Homerton that I bought in the late 1980s was about £55,000. A few years ago, a member of Sadiq Khan's team at City Hall told me that he had moved into the very same street. Indeed, into one of the houses right next door to the one that I'd left behind. I told him what I had paid for mine. He didn't tell me what he paid for his. And it was a long time before he spoke to me again. I made that last bit up. Just kidding on that last point. What was the price of the house in Thistlethwaite Road that I still live in, bought in 1992? £127,000. If I put it up for sale today, the asking price would be about £1.5 million. That, of course, is absolute madness, a point to which I will return. During my 35 years living on Thistlethwaite Road, there have been many other strands to Lower Clapton's always unfolding housing story, reflecting shifts in attitudes, tastes, political priorities, and the financial circumstances of local authorities. Most of the Nightingale estate was ceremonially blown up, part of a rolling programme of celebratory demolitions that Hackney Council called the Big Blowdown. Anybody remember those? These crowds of people used to turn up for them. It was quite a bit surreal, really. Yes, and rebuilt in a different form. The Pembury was handed over to the care of a housing association and refurbished. Gooch House still stands. That's the tower block next to Lea Bridge Roundabout. I've never been inside there, so I don't know what it's like to live there. And sadly, it's permanently linked in my mind with the murder mile period of Lower Clapton Road's history, the late 1990s and early 2000s, and almost certainly completely wrongly. I say that because I've searched without success for any report that a young man who was indeed shot inside what was then Chimes nightclub in December 2000 and then crawled fatally wounded round the corner into Kenninghall Road actually reached the covered entrance of Gooch House before he died. Somehow I got that picture in my mind and nothing can dislodge it. Perhaps it's an example of how easily we can construct misinterpretations in our imaginations. Certainly, Lower Clapton ended up grossly misrepresented by the media during that period, and it's a period that fascinates journalists to this day. In advance of the 7th of May local council elections, I spent 20 minutes on the phone with someone from New Statesman talking about those days and what has and has not happened to the area since, what with all the gentrification. In that connection and on that issue, I would like to recommend a piece I wrote for On London in September 2021 called The Parable of the Lower Clapton Tesco Express. Look that one up. I think you might enjoy it. There have been various conversions and other housing development initiatives over the time that I've spent living where I do. My eldest child was born in the Mothers Hospital on Lower Clapton Road, which was an NHS facility founded by the Salvation Army in 1913. In its place came Mothers Square, a residential development. Right by Clapton Pond, next to a pair of very handsome old houses, and across that tricky junction from the legendary Palm 2 shop, there is a small modern development, mostly of flats. Anybody know that one? Yes, I quite like it. I remember what was on that piece of land before, and I wish I had taken a photo of the estate agent sign affixed to the structure there. It said in big bold letters, "Former toilet." A rare example, you might think, of an estate agent being straightforward. On the other side of Palm 2, there is a gated community of flats above and behind the aforementioned Tesco Express. It's quite an innovative one, I think. A former council office near there has been converted into homes too. The beautiful Clapton Federation Synagogue has gone, demolished in 2006. Hard to believe it was so long ago. I was sad when it disappeared, and not only because it was a lovely building. There was, I thought, something very Lower Clapton about being able to stand at a certain point on the Lea Bridge Roundabout and see the synagogue and the Medina Mosque and the Church of St. James the Great all at the same time. Still, on the site of the synagogue, by the way, housing has appeared, built by the North London Muslim Housing Association. Remember those almshouses I mentioned right next to Clapton Pond? When I first lived around there, they were occupied by elderly people who I assumed had been there for a long time. Then they were occupied by property guardians, young people who stayed in them on a short-term, low-rent basis, perhaps until refurbishments could take place. Property guardian organisations are really the descendants of the short-life housing co-ops of the type that found me somewhere to live in Hackney in the early 1980s. Now those almshouses have been released onto the market to rent or buy, I don't know, and there are 6 bells on the to be rung outside the front gate. What about Pond House? Anyone know that one? A Grade 2 listed former country villa-style detached house in the same block as the almshouses, which stood empty for years and years. It was finally done up, converted into flats. Some accompanying terraces were added round the corner, presumably to make the finances all add up and make best use of the available space. I thought I'd a decent compromise, perhaps, between housing conservation and new supply, which is something perhaps we need to get better at if we're going to deal with some of the housing shortages that we have now. Around the corner from me, a big old house for years was sort of rotted and intermittently squatted for years and years and years until it was turned into a boutique mini hotel. 4-star rooms with private bathrooms. Guests seem to be coming and going constantly. So I think that's quite a good use of an old house that was completely gone to rack and ruin. So everywhere you look, I see that very London mix of architectures and people. And you can trace through the housing the tensions and accommodations that have been made between continuity and change. Those tensions are ever present when housing development is concerned. There are so many arguments between conservationists on one side, people who want to develop on the other side, often very difficult to resolve. I think Lower Clapton is a very good place to see that kind of thing. It's been going on for ages. For example, Clapton School for Girls, as it used to be known, was built in 1916. I checked that because I went down there this morning and it's there inscribed above the entrance. And that seems to have displaced much of that respectable row of homes along that street, Laura Road, that I mentioned earlier. And they'd only been built in 1842. So stuff's always being knocked down and change is always happening. Also change kind of creeps up on you, I find. On Thistlethwaite Road, sadly, uh, the 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 elderly ladies who used to live down the road, and I used to chat to about the latest episode of Emmerdale and so on, they've died. The Jewish couple who knew the Pinters were collected one day by their son and said goodbye for the last time. There is a steady churn of renters in the basement flat next door. The overall trend has, I would say, been upmarket, following the price graph. Again, these things kind of creep up on you. Just before Christmas, I walked more slowly than usual down the road with one of my daughters. She said, "It's definitely getting posh around here." And suddenly I could see what she meant. Nearly every door, not ours, I'm afraid, was graced with a fine Christmas wreath. And how smart and tasteful those front doors were. It was like taking a virtual tour through a Farrow and Ball colour chart. So what will happen next? As I mentioned, I took a walk round the whole neighbourhood this morning just to make sure I hadn't missed anything too obvious that should be in this talk. And of course, I found countless things that I could have included. There's those low, neat red brick homes by Millfields Park. And on the other side, the new flats, which replace some rather forbidding ones that were there before, much close to the canal, with their see-through balconies revealing the bicycles and pot plants of the latest wave of young professionals to be priced out of Dalston and sent towards Waltham Forest, where two of my daughters live. And there's that somehow Mediterranean new median-rise block on Downs Road, which, so a neighbour told me this morning, has a service charge of around £8,000 a year. Extraordinary. Then there are those quaint little houses on Row Hill Road, which I've always liked, with their low white walls at the front and their wooden porch canopies. And then there are the flats above the shops. Loads and loads and loads of them down both sides of Lower Clapton Road. Their street-level doorbells showing them to be the often forgotten units of the private rented sector, massed just above your eye line. Now and again, walking by, I see people come in and out, and I wonder to myself what their lives are like. What sort of state are their flats in? Have they been living in them for very long? Where do they hope to go next? And of course, what chance do they have of those hopes being fulfilled? When I said earlier that owning a house worth £1.5 million is a bit meaningless, I meant it in the sense that with that sort of money, you could buy half of Sunderland. But with no disrespect to Sunderland, I don't want to live there. I want to keep living in very expensive London. It will not, though, be in Thistlethwaite Road for too much longer. Only the youngest of our children is yet to fully fly the nest, and our house, though we love it, really is too big for us. Where should we go next? West to somewhere more central? East to somewhere cheaper that is starting to resemble Lower Clapton as it was when I moved in there? Somewhere smaller near where we are now? It's going to be a difficult decision, but that's the price you pay for having choice. So many fellow Londoners right across the city have little, if any, choice about where they live. Would-be first-time buyers cannot muster deposits. Social housing waiting lists are long. Private sector rents are enormous. London house prices have fallen very slightly of late, but they remain extremely high. Young people in particular are giving up hope. The many rewards of London are increasingly not worth the price you have to pay to live here, and that's a real threat to the future of the city. How to address this housing emergency is a subject for a long conversation some other day, but let me leave you with a couple of thoughts. I think that catastrophism about gentrification isn't very helpful. That phenomenon comes with a range of downsides and upsides, some of which benefit everyone. After all, when house prices are high, it is a sign that a place is appealing. Do we want to go back to the cheaper, but in some ways less nice Lower Clapton of struggling schools and scarier streets and council housing that was just not good enough? I don't think we do. What we do need is some winning combination of public investment in housing, a planning environment that helps small builders to develop small sites, very difficult for them at the moment, and a financial model for upgrading and converting buildings that have otherwise slipped into disuse. And we've got some examples of that around where I live. And in devising our housing solutions, learning lessons from the past, we need to keep focusing very hard on preserving and enhancing that very special London mix of homes and the people who live in them that has made Lower Clapton and so many other parts of Hackney a pretty good place to live. That's it. Thank you.
I think we have time for a couple of brief questions.
It's not so much a question, more a point. As owner-occupier of a flat above a shop, I wouldn't assume they're all private rented sector. And I actually have long thought that many of these flats are underused. Some of the spaces above flats in the 3- and 4-story Victorian buildings are humongous.
Yes.
And they've got one tiny shared flat in them.
Yeah, so quite often, this usually happens when there's an election for London Mayor coming up, and the Liberal Democrats usually come up with the idea that there are all these places above shops that aren't being used, and people aren't living. It's not that people aren't living above the shop the way you've described, and they're a sort of wasted asset, a kind of stranded asset. Now, I don't actually understand why that would be, but if it's is this something that you think there's a lot of?
I tend to look at
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. So, there is a point there. So why aren't those places being used? You just feel that there is political will on a big scale needed.
Okay. Big round of applause for Dave.